this is Michèle at Jasami Publishing with a new episode of Jasami Bookworm Podcast. And I am so delighted and happy today because we are visiting Judith Bowers from the Britannia Panopticon, who has a fabulous story to tell us today. Welcome, Judith.
Hello, Michèle. How are you doing?
Oh, wonderful. I always have such a fantastic time when we come to visit. We end up chatting so much. But actually, I'm going to learn something today, which I'm very, very happy about. I always like to learn. The Victorian Glasgow square mile of murder.
Yeah.
So I do know that they were infamous murders. Mm-hmm. It is within a square mile of Glasgow. Mm-hmm. And you're going to tell us about one of them. And what's her name?
Madeleine Smith.
And I'm delighted to say that I don't think she's a relative, despite the fact I'm Michèle Smith, so we'll deny that anyway. And I'll do some research.
I don't know, Michèle. I mean, this is why I've chosen Madeleine, because of the shared surname. You know, she did end up in America.
Yes, yeah. Well, that's what we do want to see and hear about. So please start with the story about who is she?
Madeleine Smith was basically a debutante. She was a very wealthy young lady. She was the daughter of James Smith, architect, chairman of, I think it was the Bank of Scotland. He's the guy that designed the McClellan Galleries, for example, on Sauchiehall Street. Very wealthy man. And of course, Madeleine was privately tutored and also was educated in London as well. And, you know, she's a very wealthy young lady and destined to be married to a wealthy young man and live a wealthy life in Victorian high society. Except for it didn't quite start off that way.
That's the best stories always do, where there's that little bit of, oh, well, life was planned out, but then there was the little hiccup. So what was the hiccup, and did it have to do with her personality, do you think?
It had to do with her being a teenage lass. In fact, she was about 19, nearly 20 years old, when she, as many, many young women do, fell head over heels in love with the wrong man.
Oh, gee, I've never heard of that happening.
And the wrong man in this case was a man called Pierre-Émile Langelier. He was the son of a seed merchant in Jersey. So he had a French accent, although he wasn't actually French, he was from Jersey. And he was in his 30s. He was 33.
Ooh, older man.
Yeah, older man, which of course to a young woman is very appealing.
Cat bait.
And he was very well dressed. He always dressed in what, you know, the finest of fashions, even though he couldn't afford them. And they apparently met in, I think it was a draper's stall on Sauchiehall Street, sometime in early spring of 1855, and she immediately fell in love with this man, even though she didn't know him, even though her family didn't know him. In fact, normally in those days, if you were a lady of a certain standing, you'd be introduced to a man via your brother, your father, an uncle, but you wouldn't just randomly speak to a stranger.
No, in fact, there were quite a lot of chaperones back then,
There were.
Oh.
And of course, she didn't have a chaperone with Emile. She just met him and spoke to him. And I think she might have been with her sister, but they weren't formally introduced in any way, shape or form. And Emile took advantage of this because he was poor. He was a clerk himself. He just worked as a clerk in Glasgow. And he was very poor, but he was a social climber.
Ah, yes, and saw the opportunity before him.
Oh, he certainly saw this as an opportunity.
In the guise of a lovely young woman.
Absolutely.
Oh,
in fact, their affair started very soon after meeting. Yeah.
An affair, back then, because you were supposed to be purity itself.
Absolute purity. And you certainly didn't go off having affairs with men who are that much older than you without your father's knowledge and consent. And of course, that's what Madeleine and Emile were doing. And of course, they couldn't just go out together like we do today. It was all secret trysts and secret meetings. he would meet her, for example, occasionally from her music class that she had on Hill Street, and walk her close to where she lived. And at this point, she had moved to Blytheswood Square. Her family had originally had a big house on India Street, and they moved to 7 Blytheswood Square, which is this huge, huge house, which is now called Madeleine Smith House.
Oh.
And the way that the house was, it was a 4-storey house, but James Smith had split it into 2. So they had the ground floor apartment with the basement. Mm-hmm. And the Minnock family, William Minnock and his father, had the upstairs floors. And Madeleine's bedroom window was practically in the pavement on the street leading up to Blytheswood Square. So they used to meet quite often at that window. And Madeleine used to write love letters to Emile.
As one did back then, no text messaging.
No text messaging.
It was the beautiful writing of letters.
It was. And she used to write these letters. I've actually seen some of them up in the Mitchell Library. They've got some up there. Oh. And they were written on the finest, like, tissue paper. Really thin paper. And she writes on one side, and then she writes on the other side, but kind of upside down. And it's really hard to translate. And there was over 250 of them written to Emile. And when she was eventually taken to court, it took something like 40-odd clerks to actually read these letters and translate them so they could be read out in court. And they were so naughty. At the resulting court case, 3 of the judges apparently fainted at the content. I'll give you an example. One of my favourite ones is because they weren't just, meeting at a window and talking. They must have met and had trysts, in the woods outside of Helensburgh when she used to go on her summer holidays to Helensburgh and their weekend jaunts away with her family because they had a house out there. They must have met in the forest and things like that in the woods and had a little bit more than a hand holding, because one of the letters actually says, and I think it's actually after she'd let him into the house on this occasion, because he had come round when her parents were out and her sister was out as well, and I think Madeleine had pretended that she was feeling ill, so decided to stay behind.
Ah, yes.
And I think she'd managed to let him in under the ruse of lending him a Bible or something like that. Anyway, she'd let him in on this occasion, and they must have had a bit of, a bit of how's your father, because one of the letters at that time, she writes, "I did not bleed in the least, but had a great deal of pain during the night. Tell me, my pet, are you angry with me for letting you do what you did?"
Oh.
And Emile's response was hilarious.
What did he say?
He said, "Madeleine, I am not angry with you, but I am sad it happened. You showed no resolution."
Oh, wow.
Isn't that amazing?
Yes.
So it was her fault that he had sex with her because she did not tell him not to.
Oh, yeah,
She didn't
of course.
fight him off. She didn't fight him off, So, because she didn't fight him off, they had sex. But it transpires, actually, the reason why she had a great deal of pain during the night was because, I don't know how to put this delicately. You can edit this out if you like, Ian. But he got the wrong hole.
Oh, no!
Yeah. You see, he'd only ever had sex with Victorian prostitutes, and they used to take up the back passage to avoid pregnancy in the clap.
Oh, my heavens to Betsy.
But apparently he got it in the right place the next time they had sex, because she then writes him a letter a couple of weeks later talking about finding spots in her undergarments.
Ah.
Yes. What do you think this means? She actually says, "I found spots in my undergarments. What do you think this means?" To which Emile replies, "Tell me if at your regular period." He used the word period. And this was actually read out in court. This was the letter that made the judges faint because they mentioned the word period.
Oh, my. That's scandalous.
Absolutely scandalous. Absolutely scandalous. So he must have thought to himself, "Oh, I wonder if she's pregnant, And it was around about all of this time that Emile was going, "We need to get married. Let's get engaged. Let's get married." And Madeleine was like, "Yes, of course, darling, so, but how are you going to afford to keep us?" And he's like, "Don't you worry. I own for £5 a year." I think it was only about £5 a year at the time. He said, it's enough for us to get, I'll get a nice flat for us and, you won't miss things. And she's like, I can live without my big gowns, and one of her dresses would have cost a year's wages. I can live without my music lessons. I can live without my social life, because, of course, she was a debutante. She was a socialite. She loved going out and partying. So she was quite happy to marry this poor clerk.
At least she said so.
At least she thought so. Exactly. I mean, she was only by this time in her early 20s. So, so she had aspirations to marry Emile. Emile certainly had aspirations to marry her. And he says, but I need to meet your father.
Oh.
Well.
That would not go over well.
No, it wouldn't, because, you see, her father, James Smith, was, like most Victorian fathers of the day, extremely strict. And Madeleine knew that if her father found out about this affair with Emile, he would more than likely send her to a convent.
Oh.
Mm-hmm. In fact, she did try to broach the subject of Emile with her father, and he did threaten to send her to a convent if she continued to see him. So there you go, she wasn't wrong. But she couldn't break it off with Emile, because Emile, when she did approach Emile about this and say, well, I did speak to my father, and he said I was to break it off with you instantly. That's the end of it, and I have to do what my father tells me, as every good Victorian girl did in those days. But Emile was, well, imagine what your father would say if I sent him your letters.
Blackmail.
Correct. Like I say, he was a social climber. So there was no way that Madeleine felt that she could get out of this situation, because Emile was going to show her father, her family, these letters, and she was terrified of what her father would do. She didn't want to spend the rest of her life in a convent.
No, she grew up with, in prosperity, being able to do what she wanted to do and have the finest things in life back then. And, as we know from the Panopticon and the stories we've heard about people that came here, it wasn't an easy life.
It was not an easy life. Definitely not for the poor.
No.
And she didn't want to be poor, and she didn't want to be in a convent, and she didn't want to give up all her luxuries and her wonderful life and get up at 5 o'clock in the morning and pray every day. She did not want that, and she loved a good ball. She was a socialite. She loved going out. She loved enjoying life. So, she kind of got herself into a bit of a situation. So she carried on seeing Emile, and Emile would come to her bedroom window most evenings of the week, and she would pass him out cups of cocoa on a cold winter's night, and they would chat away, and sometimes he would be seen by the local prostitutes. Of course, prostitution was a big thing in Elizabeth Square at that time, and he was quite well known to the prostitutes in the area as well. So they frequently saw him there. And of course, the maid, she would go backwards and forwards with these letters continuously still as well, because she carried on writing these letters to Emile.
Yes.
Because she wanted to keep him sweet. But the problem was, her father had decided that Madeleine was to marry William Minnick.
Oh, who would be from their class, and
he
lots
lived upstairs.
Of money, and he lived upstairs. Yeah. Oh, so very convenient all the way around.
Exactly. And Madeleine seemed to want to marry William Minnick,
because she would keep the same lifestyle, and she would please her father, and life could go on.
Exactly.
Now rock and hard place comes to mind.
It does, doesn't it, really? It really does. Madeleine did find herself in a little bit of a quandary. What does she do? Because if she dumps Emile, he's going to show everybody the letters. That'll be the end of the engagement to William Minnick. But the problem was, in March of 1857, their engagement, William Minnick's and Madeleine's, was due to be publicly announced in the Glasgow Herald.
Oh, so there's no keeping that quiet.
No.
Oh.
Mm-hmm. And so we think at that point, that's when she had started to poison Emile. A little bit of arsenic in his cup of cocoa. 3 grains, maybe 4 grains. Usually that's enough to kill a man.
Yes, it doesn't take much, and it was very prolific back then.
It was. But then the date of the announcement in the Glasgow Herald came upon them which was supposed to be, I think, the 23rd or 24th of March. I think it was supposed to be 24th of March, the announcement was going into the Glasgow Herald. And Emile staggered back to his lodgings, which belonged to Mrs. Jennings, and he battered at her door. She let him in, and he was doubled up in agony because he had these terrible stomach cramps. So she called in the doctor, and the doctor couldn't work out what was wrong with him, and then he died. This was the 23rd of March. 23rd of March, the day before apparently the notice in the Glasgow Herald was due to come out, and they were very suspicious about how he had died. So they opened him up and discovered over 123 grains of arsenic in his stomach.
Oh my gosh, so she gave him a lot at that point in time.
I think she panicked. You see, the thing was, Emile was a hypochondriac, and one of the things that he used to do for his health was take small amounts of arsenic because it was believed it was good for your health.
Oh, so he was already poisoning himself, but you build up a tolerance.
Exactly, so he had a tolerance. So when she was putting 3 or 4 grains of arsenic in a cup of cocoa,
it wasn't affecting him as much as it would have a normal person who didn't take it.
Exactly.
Oh my.
Exactly. So the night before the announcement, she must have panicked and just
put it all in.
Exactly. Yeah. Put a hole in to his cup of cocoa, literally death by chocolate.
Oh, yes, absolutely.
You know, and that's how Emile died.
So definitely suspicious circumstances as soon as they opened him up, and the first person they're going to look at is her.
Exactly, because they found all the letters, you see.
Means, opportunity, and motive.
Exactly. The letters were in the lodgings, you see.
Oh.
So she was worried about a scandal. Oh, boy, did she get a scandal.
Absolutely. Everything she was trying to prevent happened.
Yeah, exactly. Because, of course, she was absolutely the number one suspect. There was no doubt about it. Madeleine was the only suspect. She was the only person that could have killed Emile. And she ended up in court in Edinburgh. It was a huge case. It was a massive bit of publicity. The case itself lasted 9 days. It started on the 30th of June, which is one of the reasons why I decided that our June podcast should be Madeleine Smith.
Oh, yes, that's perfect. Yes.
Because we're coming up for the anniversary. End of this, you know, it's coming up, her anniversary of the start of the trial. So that trial lasted 9 days, and it was all over the newspapers. All over the newspapers. She had to be tried in Edinburgh. She couldn't be tried in Glasgow. And it was such a huge bit of publicity and such a huge shame on the family. I'm sure her father never spoke to her again afterwards. And she sat in the dock, this young Victorian woman from a wealthy background. And they made it quite clear that she had been blackmailed by this flashing lights. Why are we getting flashing lights? That's quite interesting. Is the ghost of Madeleine with us? Oh, I say.
Yes, it is.
Hello. Got a bit of ghostly activity going on. That's interesting. Thank you.
That's the ghost participation in the podcast.
Is it Emile or Madeleine? That's the thing.
They don't want to be left out, so we have to acknowledge them.
That.
Yes, absolutely.
You are acknowledged. Okay, my darlings. So Madeleine sat in that trial for 9 days and became a household name by the end of it, because this was a story that was about scandal, about sex, about moral decay, about, a poor man and a wealthy woman. I mean, it was just everything that a Mills and Boon book today would love. It was a bodice ripper. Everybody loves a bodice ripper, don't they, really?
Yes.
And certainly the Victorians loved them.
Absolutely.
Highly moral. They
would have been reading it in the newspaper every single day.
Absolutely.
It would have been covered in great detail. And the letters. And
the letters, of course.
They must have been absolutely scandalized.
They were absolutely scandalized. Like I say, it was 250 of them. Some of them resulted in the judges fainting. And at the end of the trial, they had to prove and not proven.
A proven or not proven.
Yeah. See, in Scotland, we've got this thing, not proven.
Yeah.
It's only in Scotland, nowhere else. Only in Scotland can you get a not proven verdict. And I think people were horrified with the reason why she got a not proven was because they couldn't actually prove that Madeleine was the one that administered the poison. Even though her name is mentioned in the poisons register a couple of times for the purchase of arsenic, even though the arsenic that she purchased from Sauchiehall Street was actually dyed with indigo dye, because the pharmacists used to put dye into the arsenic to identify the arsenic as coming from that pharmacy.
Oh.
So she had bought this particular indigo dye poison from the pharmacist on Sauchiehall Street, and the same arsenic dyed with indigo dye was found in Emil's body. But because nobody could prove that she administered it to him, and because not one prostitute saw Emile at her window on that evening, and they frequently saw Emile at the window, and because nobody knows where he was over that evening, because he hadn't told anybody where he was going, including his dear friends, they couldn't prove Madeleine was guilty. Now, if she'd been working class, it would have been a different matter. She would have been straight to the gallows. But because of the family status, because of her family's wealth, she got a not proven verdict. And that is the reason why we say getting away with it scot-free.
Oh, I never realized that.
Yeah.
See, I said I was going to learn some new facts today. Scot-free. Oh, that's true. Well, how would that have affected the rest of her life and her parents?
Well, I don't know about her relationship with her parents afterwards. I should imagine it was pretty tortured. In fact, I don't actually think she had much of a relationship with her father afterwards.
I couldn't imagine him coping with it. He would have been so embarrassed in society.
He would have been. I mean, the whole story was just so scandalous. There was no way the family was going to recover from it. And certainly not Madeleine. You know, Madeleine was so notorious by this time, she couldn't even stay in Scotland. She actually ended up moving to London.
Yes.
And that's when she married George Wardle, her first husband.
Now, how did she get him to marry her? Do you know?
I suppose because outside of Scotland, it wasn't such a big deal. I'm sure it was. It was in the London papers and in the London magazines. But George probably, by the time that they met and married in 1861, so he probably was not as familiar with Madeleine's story.
No.
And she called herself Mina by this time as well.
Oh,
she used her nickname, which was Mina, as opposed to her real name, which was Madeleine. So she maybe wasn't honest with him about all that had happened to her in her past. Who knows? You'd have to ask George, but of course George isn't here to answer that anymore.
That's true.
So they married in 1861, and George was a very important part of Madeleine's story because Madeleine was a socialite and he was the business manager of none other than William Morris.
Really?
Yes.
Oh, so he was well-known and rich. Okay.
So George Wardle had plenty of money. They had 2 children together, Thomas and Mary, who was usually referred to as Kitten. And they lived the high life. They lived the high life in London. She was a socialite. She was a watercolour artist. She was even in the Fabian Society.
So she never really suffered at all afterwards, unlike her family that must have.
No.
Oh.
She did really well. In fact, she was a founder member of the women's socialist movement through the Fabian Society. So she did a lot. Maybe she did all these things to try and repair the damage of her earlier life, because she was this daft wee lassie, you know, when she met Emile and poisoned Emile. And she always denied ever poisoning him. And she ended up, she divorced George Wardle in around about, I think it was 1890, she divorced him, something like that. And then she moved to America. She moved to New York to join her son Thomas, who was over there. And she actually remarried at the age of 81.
Oh, my.
Yeah, I know. Can you imagine? In 1916. And she didn't die until 1928 when she was 93 years old. Oh, hello.
They're back again.
They're back again. Yes.
With the flashing lights.
With the flashing
we have
lights.
That. So she she did not conform to society's rules back then. I mean, she had an affair when she was in her teens. She, divorced, and divorce wasn't done back then, moved away, and then married at 81. Yeah. And marrying at 81, I really have to kind of admire, I think that's really cool. It's, I don't condone murder, obviously, but the fact that if she did try to help society afterwards and did try to make things up, and obviously she never must have felt any guilt about it. I mean, she lived a ripe old age.
She did. Apparently, just before she died, just a few weeks before she died, she was interviewed, because, by this time Hollywood was becoming a thing, and they had asked her if they could make a film of her life, and she'd always refused and said no because she didn't murder Emile. But just before she died, maybe 2 or 3 weeks before she died, she was interviewed by a New York journalist who said to Madeleine, "Did you murder Emile?" And Madeleine's response apparently was, "Well, of course I did." So finally, before she died at the age of 93, she admitted that allegedly she admitted that she had actually murdered Emile.
Oh, wow. How would one come to terms with that in a moralistic kind of way, living with the guilt, knowing you've taken a life kind of thing? So, I did not know that. Absolutely. So she actually told someone. Was there anyone else there?
No, that's why I say allegedly, you see, because nobody else was witness to it, just this one journalist that visited Madeleine before her death. But, it was quite a thing that she would admit to it. But then, at the age of 93, that's a hell of an age.
Yes, and with double jeopardy, they wouldn't come back to her and say, "Oh, excuse me, now, we'll put you in prison for something that you did, 70 years ago."
I know exactly.
Well, sometimes you would like that to come around. So the parents, do you happen to know what their life was afterwards?
Not so much. I've never really researched James Smith, but he was a famous architect, and he did. I think he's actually buried in Glasgow. I don't know what happened to her mother, but I'm not so sure about what happened with her parents. I did have the full story of James Smith once upon a time, but it's years since I've done the story of James Smith.
I think Madeleine Smith is exciting enough, but I think they probably paid more of a price than she did.
Yeah, I think it affected James Smith's work life quite a bit. I think he kind of went underground for a little while, but don't quote me on that one, because there is a wee gap in the history that I have of James Smith, and like I say, it's been years since I talked about James.
Well, Madeleine Smith, what a life. What a life. The really good part is, because this has to do with the Victorian Glasgow square mile of murder, there are more murders. So this is going to be a series with our podcast, and I'm loving this because I will get to come back and find out about a little more murder, mayhem, and romance. Oh, I think we have a book named that. Just a little plug. I couldn't help it.
Good segue.
But you're such a wonderful storyteller, Judith, and I think that's what everybody enjoys when they listen to it on the podcast.
Oh, thanks, Michèle.
It's hearing about it. And it's true, you do. You spin a beautiful tale.
Mm-hmm. Don't forget, Michèle, everyone's a murderer given the right circumstances.
And where is that quote from?
Oh, actually, I heard it doesn't come from me personally. I'm not that clever. I know. It comes from a new programme or series on Netflix called The Inside Man. I thoroughly recommend it. I thought it was fantastic.
Well, something else to look for. All right. Thanks so much, Judith.
Thank you.
So we're coming to the end of this podcast, and as always, I'll put you on the spot. So who would you like to do your shout out to this time?
My shout out this time, I think, is to the descendants of Madeleine Smith, because her great-great-great-granddaughter, I believe, has actually written a book about Madeleine.
Oh.
And she did come to see me many, many years ago, and we went to the Ramshorn graveyard together, where I showed her the Fleming grave where Emile was originally buried, although his body was dug up by his family and removed and taken back to Jersey.
Oh, okay.
So he's not there now, so don't go looking for him.
All right.
But he was buried, his bosses, the Flemings, actually had him buried in the family plot temporarily because they felt terrible about Emil's murder. So I'd like a shout out really to Emil's family and to Madeleine's descendants.
I think that's absolutely wonderful because they've gone through so much, kind of thing. Well, my shout out is to, I have to say, we have some new interns joining us who are going to be doing some editing and working on stories. And so I would like to do a shout out to Maria and to Claire. And I think I have a few more coming soon, which will say that too. But welcome to Jasami, as we do all the wonderful things we do in life, and including with the podcast. So, as always, this is Michèle at Jasami Bookworm Podcast, wishing you a sunny day.